Welcome to our October 10th meeting of the British Empire Study Group. So tonight, without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Rob Lutens to introduce our presenter tonight. Now, just a warning, the Crimean War is a very long topic, so it may go over just a tad, and we will start bringing you over in advance, so there should be no delay. You should see no delay. So, okay, Rob, if you could take it away, that would be great.
Thank you so much, Joan. Welcome to our program this evening. It's a study of the Crimean War through postal history, and this is part one with Adrian Pearson. The Crimean War began in October of 1853 in the Crimean Peninsula and ended there in February of 1856. It was a war fought mainly on the European Crimean Peninsula between the Russians and the British, French, and Ottoman Turkish forces. This was not an American war, and typically gains but a footnote in American history books. The Crimean War is often ignored over by European postal historians. Russia was in dispute with the Ottoman Sultan over Russia's demands to protect its Orthodox subjects. Russia also conflicted with France and England over Catholicism and the holy places in Palestine. Our speaker this evening, Adrian Pearson, will examine this conflict using his postal history collection in his first of a two-part series. So a few words about our speaker. After studying ancient history and business studies at university, Adrian got a job as a numismatist, specializing in Roman coins. He's currently a technical learning designer, simulating computer systems. He loves this job and doesn't want to retire anytime soon. Adrian began collecting stamps and first-day covers in the 1970s, though he quickly became interested in postal history. He didn't specialize at that time, but just collected whatever he liked. About 20 years ago at a stamp fair, Adrian discussed specializing his collecting interests with Bill Barrell, who suggested the Crimean War as a subject in which Bill also had an interest and some material for sale. Adrian liked the idea, as he had already had some knowledge of the Crimean War and its relatively short conflict with the use of many new technologies. Since then, Adrian's been collecting Crimean War postal history, letters, and documents, and is researching the subject in even more depth. Other philatelic interests include early letters prior to 1750 and 19th century illustrated postcards. He's now using his collections to educate and entertain philatelic clubs and societies. So, without further ado, I give you our esteemed speaker this evening, Adrian Pearson.
Good evening, everybody. Well, this is what it's about. The Postal History of the Crimean War, Part 1. So there's lots to cover. As Rob said, we'll go at a fair pace. So there's three topics. It says this afternoon. I apologize. Afternoon, evening, night, or whatever time it is in your part of the world. We'll concentrate on mail from the forces in the east. That's in the Turkish Crimea region. So introduction and background. Right, picture of Tsar Nicholas I at the time of the Crimean War, and a picture of Vladimir Putin. What do they have in common? Well, one was an actual autocrat and the other is aspiring to be one. They thought God was on their side. They meddled in the neighbour's business. They both felt that European nations had broken their trust and had a sense of grievance. They felt that their army was much better than it proved. And they incorrectly thought that their opponent was weak and disunited and that local population would support them. Admittedly, some of this may be contentious to some, but we'll not just take it as I've said. So we have, on one side, we have the Ottoman Empire or Turkey, France, United Kingdom, and later in the war, Sardinia. Each had its own reasons for going to war with Russia. The war itself was fought mainly in the Black Sea region, in the Balkans, and then in the Crimean Peninsula. There was some more activity in the naval activity in the Baltic and in the Pacific. So what happened? So basically, Russia occupied the Turkish provinces of Moldavia and Wallachia. And It had done this before and didn't think anything of it. It used it to threaten Turkey, and that it was saying protecting Turkish Christians, which Turks from time to time did commit atrocities against. But this time Turkey declared war because there were British ships around and French ships around, and Turkey decided that it could beat the Russians, or at least push them back. Russia then made a surprise attack on the Turkish fleet at Sinope in November 1853. The Russian fleet came from the naval base at Sevastopol and sailed back there. So the tensions mounted, and in March 1854, Britain and France declared war on Russia and started to send troops out there. In the meantime, the Russians had invaded Turkey and were defeated by the Turks, and they abandoned the Danubian provinces, which were occupied as a peacekeeping force by the Austrians, who remained neutral. Austria was at this time a big empire, just like Russia. So British-French troops arrived and occupied the area south of the Danube, which, as you can see, with the little clashes on just down the edge of the Black Sea. The problem was cholera broke out, and cholera is a very destructive disease, and thousands of British and French troops started dying. So why did the British and French troops go to the Crimea? Well, one, the Russians had retreated. Secondly, the troops were dying without fighting a battle. And thirdly, they spent all the money getting the troops out there. It seemed silly to take them home. So they also decided to neutralize Sevastopol and neutralize the Russian Black Sea Fleet. So basically, they had to get as many ships as they possibly could, and commandeered, and the government commandeered a lot of passenger ships from various routes, the North Atlantic route, the Australia route, and there were a lot of changes. One of these ships is probably known to those who know some American history. Here is an order dictated by Lord Raglan and signed by Lord Raglan. In fact, it looks like he's written it. And it's to the commander of the 50th Regiment of Foot. And they're still unsure. He's asking they will furnish a working party of 60 men to cleanse the Trent steamer lying off the wharves. And that's the Trent steamer. And as many of you possibly know, the Trent was involved in a diplomatic incident in 1861 when it was stopped by the USS San Jacinto, who took some Confederate envoys to Britain and France. They took them on board. They arrested the San Jacinto arrested them, and there was a diplomatic incident between particularly Britain and the United States, which could have led to war between Britain and the United States. But President Lincoln and Prime Minister Palmerston had cooler heads. They let the situation cool down, so war was avoided, and they released the Confederate States envoys. Here it shows how desperate Lord Raglan was to get the steamer Trent cleaned, because it's come from the Commander-in-Chief himself, and it says they will receive double the usual working pay if they clean the ship thoroughly and speedily. They were really short of ships. So when they arrived on the Crimean Peninsula, the fleet, the British and French forces, landed at a place called Calamita Bay, which does have connotations, and they marched south towards Sevastopol. The Russians tried to stop them at the Battle of the Alma, River. I don't think you can see my cursor, but it's the top little cross swords. The Russians retreated. Some went into Sevastopol, but most of them retreated towards the centre of the peninsula. And it's possible that if Britain and France had marched, British and French troops had marched straight, they could have possibly marched straight into Sevastopol, but they were tired. They just fought a battle. And so they decided to attack Sevastopol from the south. And basically, much of the war, rest of the war, is the main Russian army is trying to dislodge them from the south. So you get the battles of Balaclava, where the famous charge of the Light Brigade took place, Inkerman, and later in the war, the Battle of Chernaya. Meanwhile, the Allies were investing Sevastopol, were firing thousands of shells and cannonballs into it. And as they destroyed the fortifications, the Russians just as quickly rebuilt them. The two main ports and naval bases were Balaclava for the British and Kamiesh for the French, although some British ships sailed out of Kamiesh as well, because Balaclava was rather tightly packed. So, now, it might seem strange this, but the Crimean War might have had a bigger effect on the United States than it actually did on Britain and France. And here's why. Effects on the United States were, there was a serious diplomatic incident, not quite as serious as the Trent, but the British minister in Washington was expelled, as well as a number of consular officials, though Britain didn't expel James Buchanan, who was the ambassador that was later president, and he was ambassador in the United Kingdom. But Britain was breaching US neutrality rules by illegally recruiting in the United States, because so many troops had died that they were trying to get soldiers from anywhere. As I've already said, changes to shipping on major routes due to the need for additional tonnage to transport British and French troops, and not just the troops, but all the supplies, all the horses, even some of the hay had to be transported out there. So a lot of shipping was taken off the main routes, for example, across the North Atlantic, which gave American shippers, which changed the names of the ships that went on envelopes, because it often had to say per steamer Asia, per steamer Canada, per steamer Pacific. Well, Pacific was an American ship of the Collins Line, and the Collins Line hoped to do well out of this situation in Europe. And indeed, it did start doing well, but then it had a couple of disasters. In 1854, the Arctic collided with I think it was the Vesta, and sank. And the Pacific disappeared altogether in 1856, possibly colliding with an iceberg, but we don't know for certain. Of course, I haven't got evidence of this because I'd like to show you, and hopefully I'll have something by part 2, but there were opportunities for American merchant vessels due to the shortage of ships. So where there's no British particularly, where there's no British ships, well, somebody's got to take the trade over. Why not American vessels? And this is probably the most important of the lot. The Crimea significantly affected the Russian economy and prestige, leading to the sale of Russian Alaska to the United States in 1867. So if there'd not been the Crimean War, Alaska might have still been Russian. So basically, the Crimean War virtually bankrupted the Russian government in the 1850s and seriously weakened Russian power. And the Russian government also had to pay compensation for freeing the serfs in 1861. So once the American Civil War was done, then the Russians made a speedy negotiation to sell Alaska to the Americans before the chance of Britain seizing it. So I think, if I remember correctly, they sold it to the Americans for $7 million. So Alaska became American. There wasn't much there at the time, apart from some whaling stations, and until gold was discovered in the Klondike in the late 1890s. So they are. Alaska being American is a legacy of the Crimean War. What else? Well, the major and cultural and technological advances, and many of these were used in the Civil War, which was only 5 years later, after the Crimean War had finished. And there were American observers probably on both sides, because the American envoy, the Russian envoy in America was quite close to the American government, even though the Americans disliked autocracy. It suited their foreign policy. So what did we have? We have steamships, including armored vessels. I mean, we all know about the Monitor and the Merrimac, but the French and British were building armored vessels towards the end of the war to go and attack Russian forts. Steam locomotives. A lot of the mail was carried across France by rail and across Europe. And eventually, steam locomotives were brought out to the Crimea to fetch supplies up from Balaclava. Electric telegraph. The American Civil War followed the telegraph and the railway lines to a large extent. And in the Crimea, when the telegraph got out there, the generals found out that the governments could tell them what to do a lot more easily than they could previously. Extensive use of mass-produced rifles. In the Crimean War, you've got the mini rifle, which was a great advantage when the war started, though the Russians soon tried to catch up and use rifles themselves. Civil War, it was the Springfield rifle, though again, a multiplicity of other weapons were used. Trench warfare. There's trenches, the attacking trenches outside Sevastopol. Just read the trenches before Richmond and Petersburg. Prefabricated hospitals, anaesthetics, and organised nursing. Well, the hospitals were designed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who was a major scientist and engineer in Britain. Anaesthetics was chloroform, basically, always in short supply in the Crimea. In fact, hardly used in the Crimea, but it was available. I'm not sure how much chloroform was available in the American Civil War. Organised nursing. So in the Crimean War, you had Mary Stanley and Florence Nightingale. In the American one, you had Dorothea Dix, and I can't remember this lady, was it Clara Barber, but I can't remember her name. And again, they had trouble setting up an organised nursing service, and they had all had conflict with the medical establishment. Photography in the war zone. We had Roger Fenton, you had Matthew Brady taking photographs. War correspondence. I'm sorry, I don't know the name of American war correspondents, but William Howard Russell, who'd been a major war correspondent in the Crimea, went out and wrote for the Times of the American Civil War. And an organised mail system for the forces, which is a major aspect of the Crimean War. I'm not sure how much it was reflected in the American Civil War, because being a civil war, you'd already got the postal systems there to a degree. So for the British, forces postage, the earliest forces postage was in the War of the Austrian Succession in the 1740s. And that is a very rare mark, the AB mark for Armée Britannique. And during the wars of the 18th century, forces postage increased, although there were no special marks. The Postage Act of 1795, when we were just starting to fight revolutionary France, brought about concession rates for private soldiers and sailors. And, excuse me, and what it made, to encourage, to improve morale, private soldiers and sailors were allowed to send mail home, and their wives and families could send mail to them for a penny, which was a lot less than the ordinary rate, which was probably about 10 pence or even more, which they couldn't afford. So, postage arrangements for the army in the East. So you've got all these troops out into the Crimea, and how does the mail work? Well, it was a bit chaotic at first. So the main mail routes, as you can see, it's like a little spider's web. The penny postage for ordinary soldiers and sailors was sent sent from Constantinople, so back from the Crimea or the Balkans, Varna, via Constantinople, which is the capital of the Ottoman Empire, and on a British ship going to Malta and arriving at Southampton. But the problem was they had to wait till there was a British ship going that way, so there wasn't a scheduled service. It was when a ship was going home, that mail was put on it at the penny charge. The more organised route, which private soldiers and sailors could use, but not at a special rate necessarily, was from Constantinople to Marseille in southern France, across France by rail to Calais, across to Dover and to London. Less heavily used routes were from the Ionian Islands up through Trieste to Aachen, and again across to probably Ostend and then London, and through the Austrian Empire from Turkey itself. The bulk of the Crimea mail in my collection went via the French route, mainly from officers, not exclusively, but mainly from officers. So that went via Messina and Marseille across France. So how much did it cost? Well, originally it was expensive. Black Sea Fleet, 11 pence, but the direct packet boat. British Naval Transport in Turkish waters, a shilling via French packet. From Constantinople, it was a shilling by French packet, 1 and 4pence via British packet, 1 and 9pence or via British packet, 11 pence via Southampton, and there was 8pence via private ship. And officers, out of that, the captain of the private ship could take 2pence. The Baltic Fleet had a number of rates, but it was basically 8pence, but we won't deal with that extensively today. So once the concession rates came in, you still had the penny for soldiers and sailors on a Queen's ship transport and threepence for officers from the Baltic Fleet, penny and again the same but from the Black Sea Fleet. Penny threepence via France and a penny via Queen's ship transport. I'll explain a little bit more about why it's via France. The Baltic Fleet was a bit more complicated. Well, since we're dealing with the Black Sea and Turkey tonight, we'll not go into detail on the Baltic Fleet. So how did these different rates come about? Well, the Treasury discussed with the Post Office what the Post Office needed to earn from these and the costs, and the Treasury issued a Treasury warrant. So that's the formal Treasury warrant. The Treasury warrant was then publicised in the London Gazette, where a lot of official correspondence and promotions of officers, etc., was listed. And then the Post Office issued a notice to the public, which went up in post offices, so the public could know what the costs were and what the rules were. So we've talked about the mail going on French ships for threepence, and the mail going on British ships for a penny for a private soldier or a sailor, a seaman. Bear in mind that these penny rates had to be signed for by the commanding officer or a responsible officer. And you can see on this, in 1854, May to December, 325,000 were sent from the forces in the East, and only 2,500 on British ships. And in the other direction, 282,000 on French ships, and again, 1,000 on British ships. So the route via France was by far the most popular. Later on, in January to December 1855, you can see how the postage has increased, and I'm afraid I don't have any 1856 figures in the report of the Postmaster General, so I don't know. Again, it's somewhere. A lot of this needs further research, but we're getting there. So what did it look like at the start of the war? So here we have what a shilling and fourpence rate. It's gone via France. And it's going out to Gallipoli, which is near Constantinople. And there was a French post office at Gallipoli. There may have been a British one, but we're not certain about that. But I think it's mainly the French and the British. Early in the war, the British unloaded mail at Gallipoli. So this is you can see this is a 10p embossed and a 6p. So you got 12 pence to the old shilling, and then 4 old pence in addition to that to make what we call 1 shilling and fourpence. We've got a 1 and threepence rate here. This is a curious, and this is on the right hand side. This is a curious item. It's got a 1 and threepence charge, but and it's gone via a French packet boat into Marseille, but it's been picked up at Gallipoli, and it's got a very rare Gallipoli cancellation on it. I don't know whether you can see my cursor just there. And it's got that's what the Gallipoli cancellation looked like. So that civilian packet rate, which is the square cancellation, sorry, the rectangular cancellation, that was for the French packet at the time, the civilian packet, rather than a proper mail packet set up for the Crimean War itself. So here are some more postage. Here's a 1 and a penny, 1 shilling and a penny. It used to be written 1 and a big stroke 1, and I'm old enough to remember that in the UK. That is from Malta, and the island of Malta, and the island of Malta was never allowed to have the concession rate. All posts from Malta, to and from Malta, had to be at the full civilian rate. So that was always the case. But and even early on, Constantinople, you've got the shilling rate going out to an officer, 79th Highlanders, Scutari Constantinople, because there'd been no agreement with the French as to how it was to be carried at this early stage. As you can see, May 27th, 1854. That's on the back stamp. Just there, if you can see my cursor. This is interesting. It shows to me, I feel very strongly with philately that it's not just about the postal rates, it's about the whole thing. And often a letter can lead to a whole new way of looking at something. The letter on the left-hand side to Rear Admiral Hay from his son, I think it's James Hay, it's got a 1 and 9p rate, but I didn't know it had anything to do with the Crimean War. It's just of the right date, and there were no cancellations to tell me. So I bought it, but not realising I didn't know exactly where James Hay was. In fact, I didn't really. Oh God, sorry, is it James or Edward? I can't remember. Wait a minute, Edward Hay, sorry. Midshipman Edward Hay. And then a little later, I managed to purchase another letter from Edward Hay. And the letter says, off Odessa, April 1854. And that linked it to the Crimean War. And it's also linked it to the quite unusual, but known about, 1 shilling and 9p rate. So that is a totally civilian rate at 1 and 9p, because he was on his way out there, and that's at the start. I think he must have been based in Constantinople, because obviously there was a shipboard. It may have been based in Varna for the I won't say it was a raid on Odessa, but he was monitoring the Black Sea port of Odessa, which then it's in the Ukraine now, but it was then part of Russia. Right, this is a rather grubby letter to the United States at the 1 and 2p rate, and as you can see, it's going to New York. And wait a moment. And it's Matthew Woodall, and he's writing to his dear wife and family. I'll just open it up. Oh, sorry, apologies. Oh, please. That's it. He's writing to his dear wife and family, and he's talking about coming to America. He mentions people who have died, so he's in Lancashire. And towards the end he relates, and you may see it here, if you look at the second line, Emperor Nicholas. And he's saying, the Emperor Nicholas of Russia has put great consternation on this country, that is Britain, and Turkey. Everything we buy is very high. So basically, because the trade routes have been disrupted, because so many ships had been taken to transport troops, horses and supplies, getting hold of material and foodstuffs, for example, was a lot more difficult. So prices obviously went up. It's basically war. It's a bit like I don't know whether it's affected the United States, but for example, the war in the Ukraine, the current war in the Ukraine has forced prices in Britain up, food and fuel prices. This I'll say it's got a manuscript 1 and 2p, and it's sent from West Burton, Liverpool, May 11th, 1854. And it says June 1st. It looks like it's arrived on June 1st, presumably into New York and forwarded on. So basically, postage was so relatively expensive, even for officers, and it would surprise you that, but it led some people to, if someone's coming back to London, they would take a batch of mail with them and post it unpaid in London. So that, for example, on the left, this has been sent from John Montague Burgoyne of the Grenadier Guards to his mother, and it's being charged 2p because it was sent uncancelled, unstamped, didn't have a stamp on it. So it's sent unpaid. She's paid a penalty of a penny, so it's penny postage and a penny surcharge because it was unpaid, but it's still cheaper than paying a shilling, especially when there are lots of mails being sent. So it saved the people out in the Crimea or the people at home from paying penalty postages. The letter on the right has got an 11p cancellation, in manuscript. And technically, concession rates had come in at the end of May 1854. This is July. This still says June 25th. I think this is because it was sent from Varna, and Varna hadn't set up a post office at that time. The postmaster literally arrived in Varna on the 20th of June, and this is dated the 25th, and it's probably one of the earliest to have a post office British Army post cancellation, which I'll explain about later. So we've got lots of different rates of postage. I've probably confused you all by now, so I apologise for that. But what it was, to get the concession rates into operation, Britain and France came to an agreement. And this is not in my collection. This is on the right hand side is the agreement in our postal museum, the actual text of the agreement with the French. So what they said was that the French would take British mail at their rate, which in effect worked out to threepence per. Oh, sorry, I apologise. Just a minute. Oh, excuse me. Which would be threepence up to a quarter of an ounce, and then in multiples of threepence for each up to half an ounce, and so on as the mail got heavier. It wasn't literally threepence, so sometimes it was sixpence between the heavier mail. Well, the most of the mail was under half an ounce, so it was either threepence or sixpence. And Britain agreed to transport some of the mail from the Baltic to France, though that is very rare. Also, after the agreement, the British Post Office sent out two postmasters, Edward Smith and Thomas Angel. And Mr. Smith's instructions, he had to go to Constantinople, and with his own money and a loan from the commander-in-chief, he had to obtain a backlog of mail from the French, which had been accumulated at the French post office in Constantinople because there wasn't a British one. There was a huge problem with sorting and distribution because some British officers mainly wouldn't pay for the mail for their regiments. They only wanted their own. And so they needed somebody to organise the distribution of mail on behalf of the British Army. And so I said, Mr. Smith is on these instructions from the Postmaster General on the left-hand side. And here is a picture of a rather flamboyant Thomas Angel on the right-hand side. And he seems to have been a bit of a character and he's got a bit of a swagger about him, whereas Mr. Smith was often ill. And a lot of negotiating with various people was done by Thomas Angel, who was the junior postmaster. But and most of the requests are to Thomas Angel rather than Edward Smith. So where were the post officers? Well, we've got the British post offices, that is, but most of them, the French ones, were in similar places. You may have had a British post office in Gallipoli, but there was certainly a French one there. There were the British and French post offices in Constantinople. There was a British hospital at Scutari later on from spring of 1855 onwards. While the armies were there, there was a major post office at Varna, which is where you got that 11p rate. And once they got to the Crimea, there was a post office that opened up in Balaclava. And we'll look at these in more detail. The British post office at Constantinople was originally in Galata. But they discovered that the French post office had a much better situation in Pera, which was a slightly posher area of Constantinople at the time, and that there was a vacant house next door. The owner of the vacant house wanted an absolute extortionate rate of £200 a month, which for the time was ridiculous. But then the British government put a British ambassador, Lord Stratford de Ratcliffe, put pressure on the Sultan's government to reduce the rate. So in fact, actually, they found out that the French were getting it really cheap, and so Britain wanted the same rate. So they got it at a reasonable rate. A little later on, they opened the post office at Scutari. In fact, actually, now I come to think, it might have been rent-free at Pera, but it's certainly low rate rental. Here's what the post offices look like. Now, as you can see, there's an air of chaos. These are from the Illustrated London News. And I think that's the post office at Galata on the left-hand side. And you can see there's mail on the floor. There's people demanding the posts. It's all a bit chaotic. What's I like about this illustration is that there's a postal notice on the wall at the left-hand side. And it's literally as a postal notice would be put in the post offices, both at home and abroad. And I really like that. So there's the area of chaos. And all right, we don't see the inside of the post office at Pera, which is on the right-hand side, but it does seem a little bit more orderly and calmer. So here we have at Balaclava. The post office picture of the Balaclava post office here looks a bit decrepit. I'm not sure, I think it was possibly still decrepit during the Crimean War, but perhaps not as bad as it looks there. I'm just judging it from the door behind Mr. Angel in the earlier photograph. Later on, about at the end of 1854, Lord Raglan pressured Mr. Angel to move the post office from Balaclava up to British Army headquarters on the plains before Sevastopol. And Mr. Angel managed to prevaricate, which wasn't easy to do when it's the commander of the forces that's making a firm request to do it. What the compromise eventually was is that the Balaclava post office stayed open and another post office was set up at headquarters. Also, further clerks were sent out because obviously the number of post offices is increasing, and the local Turkish clerks, what they'd had previously, weren't very reliable. They'd replaced those with soldiers, but again, they weren't trained post office staff. So about a dozen clerks and another, at least one or more postmaster came out to Pera and also to the Crimea. As you can see, this must be after this plan on the left-hand side must be after April 1854, because it's got the telegraph office next door to the post office. So that gives you a bit of the date. It's got Lord Raglan's house on the left-hand side, so if you needed to send a telegram or whatever, or send some mail, could do so. So here we get to the knitting. Here we get to what I'd call the crux of this talk. What was on the envelopes? Well, got postal rates to and from Malta and Turkey, civilian and military. Well, civilian rates didn't change. So and post from Malta didn't change. On the left-hand side, you've got a full rate, 1 shilling mail to the HM Transport Lord Dalhousie. There was a big issue over that because sailors on transports who were taking the soldiers out to the Crimea begrudged the fact that the soldiers could send mail at a concession rate, whereas they couldn't. So there was a lot of pressure to make the concession rates, the threepence rate and the penny rate, apply to transport crews as well. And eventually, at least with the threepence rate, that was conceded. As I said, Malta never never got the concession rate. So this one, although it's later in 1854 in August, it's still 1 shilling and a penny. So obliterators and postmarks. This is what we call famous the British Army Post Office. Oh, sorry, Post Office British Army. This is February 1855. By the way, an obliterator is what goes on the stamp, which is the O star O, and the postmark is what goes elsewhere on the envelope. So those how the postmarks and the obliterator are listed in the post office record books. Towards the end of the war, and you can see it's December 22nd, 1855, some new postmark some postmarks were issued, but these were not used. Balaclava headquarters, Scutari Hospital, and Constantinople. They weren't used because obviously the war was coming to an end, and they didn't see the need for them. They may have been used on money orders, and the Constantinople one certainly was used on money orders. There are 3 letters known with the Constantinople during 1856 where the Constantinople mark was used on letters, and I've seen one in my time of collecting. It went for a lot of money. I didn't bid on it. It was too much for me. So that's what you need to look for. Constantinople British Army. Now the obliterators, these were used in the East for the armed forces. These are quite scarce, and I'll explain why later, because most of the mail was bagged up and sent to London, and it was the stamp mail had an obliterator put on it in London. But two cancellations, which are quite scarce, were used out in the Crimea or in the theatre of war. I personally think this is no evidence really that the Crown and Stars was for headquarters staff and the O-Star was in Constantinople. I have reasons for suspecting that, but it's not conclusive. You can see that they both often badly applied. It's interesting, the cover on the left has got quite worn dies on the stamps as well, which is interesting. The cover on the right is even more interesting because it's probably, not certainly, but probably being written by Florence Nightingale. The jury's out. An autograph collector I asked said it wasn't, and someone who's written a book about Florence Nightingale said it was likely to be her writing. So postmarks used for the forces in the East, these were applied to all mail, apart from a certain time when the postmaster was ill. But most mail from the Crimea has one of these on the back, or from Turkey. You've got type 1 with no code letter, June 1854 to 1856. Type 2 with code A for Constantinople. Type 2 again, code B for Balaclava. Again, those are of a fairly similar period. And type C, which is scarce. I found I think I've done a census and found 33. It's reverse code C of Scutari Hospital, which was the main hospital base where Florence Nightingale was based. Colours. Postmark without code letter, it's the number of colours, as you can see, blue, black and green, and then the Constantinople postmark is usually in red, blue or blue-green. And again, blue and blue-green. Scutari Hospital is usually in blue-green. Scutari Hospital, invariably, if it's a cancer, if the letter has got stamps on it, it always has the OXO stamp. I call it OXO, O-star O. So, the thing about Crimean War mail is you get stamped and unstamped mail. Part of the concession was that unstamped mail could be sent, and they wouldn't be paid, and the receiver wouldn't have to pay a penalty. In the other direction, it was made a rule that all mail had to, from the middle of 1854, all mail to the Crimea and Turkey had to have adhesive stamps on it. But because there was a shortage of adhesive stamps out in Turkey, the post office allowed ordinary mail to be sent, and it wouldn't, the recipient would pay and not pay a penalty. So the letter on the right is to a Mrs. Marks. That is the sister of a lady called Fanny Doobly, who wrote a journal of the war, and she says that she was the only officer's lady that was out there throughout the whole war. Obviously, there were some other camp followers up for the troops. Yeah, the letter on the right has a special free cancellation, which was used when Mr. Smith at Constantinople was ill. So rather than writing it on, they cancelled it in London with that special free postmark. And it's apart from one exception that I've seen, it's generally used between December 1854 and end of March 1855. Here's unstamped mail that's been forwarded. And so basically it's arrived, and the threatments has been crossed out because the post office has to forward it, so it's had to pay the extra penny charge for inland postage. The same applies to the one on the right-hand side, and here, just to avoid an error by the post office clerk and whoever's receiving the letter, they've actually got a local stamp, first postage not paid. In other words, nobody's paid the threats, so it's a full fourpence to be charged. With stamp mail, this is what you normally see. As I said, what I call the OXO cancellation and the Crown and Stars cancellation are quite rare. I've got a slightly unbalanced collection because of the number I've got, but most letters here were sent bagged up into post office bags, had a seal applied, a British Army seal applied. This may be unique. It's on a registered letter that I've got, but that is a British Army bag seal. And then they were sent back to London to be cancelled. So here is Charles Russell Esquire, which some dealers were selling as being sent by William Howard Russell, the war correspondent, but it's not. It's by, what's a moment? It's by a VC winner, Brevet Major Charles Russell, who won the Victoria Cross at the Battle of Inkerman. The other letter is going out to the Crimea, and that's to Lieutenant Colonel Cox. It's a major correspondence. There was so much mail coming from the Crimea in these mail bags that the post office in London first had double cancellations from 46, and they actually had triple cancellations all on one stamp, so that the sorter's arm wasn't worn out, be cancelling the stamps all over. This particular letter out of my collection is unusual in that it's going out to the Crimea, but it's got so many stamps adhesives on it that the post clerk has decided to use the triple 48 cancel, so number 48 and 49. So it's very unusual for that. Here's, as we had forwarded unstamped mail, forwarded stamped mail, different scenarios. The first one on the top left, it's followed this officer around. I think it's to Woolwich Barracks. Oh no, it's gone to Winchester. No, I think he's the captain. I can't read his name, but it's followed him around and it's not being charged any extra. The one on the top right has been sent unpaid with the threatments on, and then it's obviously been delivered, and the person has then forwarded it on with a penny adhesive. The letter at the bottom is quite unusual because it's got an OXO cancellation, and it's then being forwarded on using a penny stamp. It's been delivered. It's been forwarded on using a additional penny stamp. And also, what I love about this, the person who sent it used the edge of a sheet of stamps to seal it, so you can read the above the address, the stamp above the address instructions on the edge of the sheet. These are forwarded mail that's gone a bit more dramatic. The first one's arrived in the UK at Threaten's rate. It's then had to go to France to a hotel in Paris, and so it's been charged 8 decimes. And that's not a manuscript cancellation. That's a hand stamp, the 8 decimes, and it's arrived in Paris. And it's quite poignant because whoever's written it has put the last. So I haven't researched this officer. It looks like he's possibly one of the Crimea, one of the cholera fatalities, looking at the date on it. That's August 4th, 1854, when it was sent. The second, the one on the right-hand side is really interesting. It was taken to London and delivered, and posted in London. It's got it's had a 4-penny stamp on to be sent to France, and I think the postal clerk thought it was a penny stamp from the Crimea and charged it 2pence, realised the mistake that there was a 4-pence stuck on it, so scribbled that out, and it then got sent to Paris. The holy grail of Crimean War collectors is to find a surface printed stamp on an envelope from the Crimea. This is the nearest I've got, although it's not from the Crimea itself. The letter is from the Crimea, but it wasn't posted with the stamp in the Crimea. But because the rates were multiples of 3s, there's no reason to have a 4-penny stamp out in the Crimea. So I've never seen one, but you never know, one might turn up for some reason. Another scarce Crimean oddity is the use of imperforate stamps, because perforations have been developing in Britain from the early 1850s, and most stamps were perforated. But there are a few gone out, so they would have had to be taken out to the Crimea by officers and soldiers going out there. This is particularly rare because it's got a strip of 3-penny red brown imperforates with quite a decent crown and stars cancellation. The other has got a reasonably nice OXO cancellation, Owen and cipher, and it's got a 2pence imperforate. Embossed stamps. The 10-pence had been in for a while, and that's the 11-pence rate out to Malta. William Fosbury it's from a letter from his sister, and he was on his way out to the Crimea, but they'd stopped at Malta, so that letter caught up with him, hopefully. This one, I've no idea it's not registered. I don't know how that's been worked out, but it's 1 and 7-pence. It's the Honourable George Eliot, care of Odo Russell at the British Embassy, Constantinople. Odo Russell was the son of the British Prime Minister at various times, Lord John Russell. These are curious things. These are penny pink envelopes, postal stationery envelopes. Again, they would have had to be taken out with officers and soldiers. And the first one, the post office decided that it was a civilian letter. So although whoever sent it and made up this with 2 stamps, so you got the threatened rate, the post office, because it was a penny pink envelope, decided it was a civilian letter and charged it 9-pence for the shilling rate, which was a bit harsh. But that's the way they saw it. Whereas because the crown and stars, sorry, not crown and stars, the OXO cipher has been added to this other one, it was obviously a military letter, so they let the post office let that one go through at the concession rate. Here are some heavier letters. Cox correspondence that's going out to the Crimea. And you've got a penny pink envelope that because it's going to the Crimea, to the Coldstream Guards, Post Office accepted it. And here was again, so that's at sixpenny rate. And here's a rare sixpenny rate with adhesives coming from the Crimea to Salisbury in England. And that's got the OXO cancellation. And just landed in the Crimea. This letter is actually postmarked before it was written. When they went over to the Crimea in the big fleet, including the steamer Trent, they just landed, but the mail was still on the ships, and it was chaos. The post office was moved around between ships before it landed, and it was rather chaos. They've got the mail in buckets. So this one is north of Sevastopol, just after the Battle of the Alma. No, it's just before the Battle of the Alma, September 16th, 1854. Talking about the landing, but it's actually an entire, and it's postmarked September 10th, 1854. Right, news of British victories and Russian atrocities. This actually sounds a little bit like the Ukraine today with the Russian atrocities. I can't say how true or what they are. I'm not making any opinion. So this was sent to sorry for keeping you. Yeah, this was sent to Joseph Fellows in Geneva, Ontario, and he was a lawyer, Ontario, New York, and he was a lawyer. And I think looking in Wikipedia, he had something to do with sales of purchases of land from the Indians, and he was also involved in a major legal case at the Supreme Court, where one of the Indians said that they'd be pushed off by force. Now he's here. He's talking about his lawyer. Wait a minute. There has been a commotion in Sevastopol. The inhabitants wish to capitulate, and for the expression of their wish, 500 were shot. The Poles too revolted, and their masters had them chained to the guns to make them work them. When belligerents are obliged to resort to such measures, the day of retribution cannot be very far off. So I've still got to find out some more about the person who sent it. Right, recruiting abroad, the German Legion. Now, as I said, I've spoken about trying to recruit in the United States. Here, the British also tried to recruit Germans, Italians and Swiss legions. The German Legion was the only one that really got underway, and it actually got out to Turkey. This is from the Kulali barracks near Scutari, and it's by a British officer, and he's the major in the 1st Jaeger Regiment of that's light cavalry in the German Legion. This is the 2nd Jaeger Regiment. The letter from Colchester is an internal letter, but it's in an envelope of the 2nd Jaeger Regiment at Colchester. And getting towards the end, not everybody supported the war. This is a Valentine's Peace envelope, and it's to Reverend John Bowl and his new wife Marion in Vermont. And they emigrated to the US in May 1853 and arrived in South Reigate, Vermont in October 53. And they were eventually the parents of 7 children. So that's quite fragile and quite scarce. There we are. I don't think, it's not too bad for time.
Thank you for that. That was wonderful, Adrian.
Well, thank you.
It was interesting seeing the embossed stamps on Postal History. I only see them as cutouts usually.
Yeah, but they're not common. I think most of them are cut to shape, but there's one or two
Yeah.
squarish ones. But the problem with the Crimea is that because it was a war zone, a lot of the covers and letters are rather grubby. So you can't go for pristine. And if it's pristine, then you get a bit suspicious about it.
We have a question. Is there a lot of mail coming to or from the U.S. during the war? And was there any censorship?
Right. I can't say about how much mail there was during the war, but mail continued to the US, and it was because there were still ships to supply the need. It just would not be. It would be different ships, and most likely slower ships. Apart from possibly apart from the Collins liners themselves, and the Collins liners were quite fast ships, but they weren't very profitable. So, and as I said, they had a couple of disasters. So that's the answer to that. Now, the thing about the Crimean War, which is again a boon to the historian, is there was no censorship whatsoever. Not in Britain, no, neither Britain or France. And the Russians, because the Russians actually found it, the Russian government found it easier at the start of the war to have agents in London reporting what was happening in the British press, or to get papers sent to, for example, Brussels. And it was easier for them to read to read the war correspondence dispatches to the Times to find out what was happening than actually to get dispatches from their own army in the Crimea, because obviously it could be sent by telegraph to St. Petersburg. And it took them into 1855 before they eventually got a telegraph themselves down to the main forces. So, and I've got some superb letters that's written home and criticizing particularly Lord Raglan. I think they're quite hard on Lord Raglan, but criticizing the staff, and eventually, and so both that and the correspondence caused the fall of the British government, and it was replaced. Lord Aberdeen was replaced by Lord Palmerston as the Prime Minister in early 1855. And the candor of some of these letters are quite amazing. And the other thing is that until they got the telegraph out to the Crimea, British dispatchers went to Stratford de Redcliffe in Constantinople, and then by a diplomatic bag on the ship to Marseille and then to London. Whereas the war correspondents got a quick ship to Varna and wrote. Now, I don't know when the telegraph office got out to Varna, but the nearest telegraph at the start of the war was in Belgrade. But it was still quicker for them to ride to Belgrade so that the government could learn what was happening in the newspapers quicker than they got their own dispatches. Obviously, that changed once the telegraph got out to the Crimea.
All right. Dennis Doran was asking a question. I see it disappeared, but at any rate, have you ever collected the other side of this story? Any of the postal history, from the opposing countries?
Yeah, that's part two.
Ah, okay.
I've got to save something back for you. Luckily, I've got somebody who can read Old Russian, so that's not too bad. I know a little bit about what I've got.
Oh, that's
I can't
excellent.
read Russian.
We've got a question here from Kenneth Catta. This is kind of an identification question. He's got a cover addressed to Lord Lovat with both a 1 penny and 2 penny stamp and a British Army Post Office 8/19/1854 postmark with a manuscript saying Via Marseille. Is
Yeah.
this a Crimean War cover?
Yes, it is.
Ah,
If it's got British Army Post Office on the back, then it's a Crimean War cover, and that's basically the concession route via Marseille, which is the main route.
all right, that's great. Alex Walker, my friend from the forum, he has a question here.
I'll unmute myself. Yeah. Hi, Adrian. I met you very briefly at York a year ago, and I have corresponded with you about a cover that I had addressed to a Mrs. Russell, but it turned out not the right Russell after all.
Yeah.
However, my question, very little of the mail has 1 penny rate. Now, I understood that the penny rate was for the ordinary soldier, whereas the 3-penny rate was for the officer. But are you telling me that if it went by Marseille, it could be an ordinary soldier writing it, not just an officer?
If he was willing to pay the threats,
Yeah.
he didn't have to send it by the penny rate. As you saw, there were only 2,500 in the whole 18.
The penny rate is very scarce. Very scarce.
It's very scarce indeed. I've got one. I've not. There's usually also something wrong with them. I saw one at an auctioneer's, and somebody had gone and written over all of it. They'd written in pencil, and then somebody had gone and completely written over the top in pen. So I didn't bother with that. I have one. And it's from, and again, it's going to come up in the part 2. It's from a ship's captain's wife who was along with him, and she wrote to her sister, and she got the captain, her husband, to sign it as if she was an ordinary seaman. And sometimes these letters got through at a penny rate, and sometimes they didn't. And sometimes the sister had to pay 11p sometimes because the post office court spotted them. But they took the chances.
Yeah. One of the reasons for my confusion was I have a letter which is apparently come from a pipe major in one of the Highland regiments. I think it was the 93rd.
Can I interrupt you? Is it Pipe Major Stewart?
Yes, and it's a threepence.
It's a big correspondence, yes. I've got a number of these letters.
No, he's not an officer. He's a senior warrant officer, is he not?
Yeah, that's correct.
But he pays the full 3-penny rate, not just the penny rate, because it went via Marseille.
Yeah, anybody, a private soldier could pay the threepence rates. If somebody was willing to pay it, then it would go via the higher rate. I'm trying to remember whether the penny rate included. I think it was just private soldiers. I don't think it included non-coms, but I'm not. I'd have to check that one by the Act, and the regulations were changed from time to time anyway. So I can't remember whether it included non-commissioned officers or not. I will be honest that. But it was mainly for private soldiers and ordinary seamen.
All right, thanks for that question, Alex. Anybody else have a question for Adrian? Adrian, have you ever been to the Crimea yourself?
No. Well, I know people who have, and there is quite a good book, and I can't remember who it's by, but it's saying the Crimea then and now, and the person went out there in 2010. While we were, before any issues started. So they took photographs and using Fenton's photographs and tried to line them up as much as possible. So that's quite a good book. I can also recommend another good book, Trevor Royal, The Crimean War, because that's got quite a detailed chapter on the issues with Britain recruiting in the United States and the, shall we say, spat that occurred because of it.
I have a question for Mr. Pearson, if I may. This is Dan Byam in New York. Mr. Pearson, how difficult is it to find Crimea canceled envelopes these days? Are there any collectors willing to part with some? I'd especially be interested in a cover going to an artillery unit, being a former Marine Corps and U.S. Army artillery officer.
There's one or two on eBay. There's one or two on Del Campe. Bill Barrell has got quite a few. Bill Barrell is probably your best person to buy from, and his prices for Crimean War, the more common Crimean War items with the threepenny stamps cancelled in London, his prices are quite reasonable. If you just look him up, just put Bill Barrell into your browser, and the site will come up, and he's got quite a few Crimean War letters. I've purchased quite a lot from him. I mean, obviously, it was in his interest as well as mine to start collecting, and I also buy quite a number at auction.
Okay,
So,
thank you very much.
If I can come back in and here on this one, I'll endorse that. I've only started collecting Crimea stuff for maybe about 3-4 years. And certainly it was Bill Battle's contribution that got me going. I got 3 letters from the Hall correspondence, Adrian. You might have recognized that from Edinburgh.
Yeah.
Colonel Hall and his son, Lieutenant. Bill had about 12 letters from this correspondence. I
Yeah.
could afford 3.
yeah,
So
I
I
mean,
bought 3, and I went back 6 months later, and I said, "Have you got any more of that?" "Oh, the other 9 have all gone." Yeah.
I don't know whether I've
You
got
don't
one or
buy
not.
them when you see them. They are there. They are there. Adrian, there's a lovely cover on Del Campe at the moment with a shilling rate. It's to one of your recipients, Colonel Elliot.
It's
I
a
think
very,
died-
it's yeah, £400.
I think he died of cholera in Varna early in the war. Now,
Yeah.
it's to him, it's at 2,200
Oh,
euros.
yes, that's it. Yeah, it's a silly price. It's a silly price. Yeah, it
I
should.
thought it was.
It's a crazy price.
Yeah.
It's a crazy price. That, yes, I know the one you mean.
Yeah.
I think if for a nice one with a shilling stamp, I
With
would
a
be.
shilling embossed on it, yes, it has.
Yeah.
It looks pretty, but I wondered about it, but it's out of my
No,
budget.
no,
It's-
no.
it's-
You're welcome. You're
beyond
welcome.
my-
If you want advice, you're welcome to contact me. In fact, I'm happy to give advice. And not that I'm necessarily that much of an expert. I'm more of a historian as well as a philatelist. But if anybody does want advice about that, then please contact me.
I have your email.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so please email me, and if anybody hasn't got my email, I think Joan said she'll or you.
Yep,
you know,
just
you can be
email
followed up.
us and we'll get it
Yeah.
to Adrian.
Yeah, so that's fine. Yeah, no, you've got to be so careful. Prices are wild, and I've paid a lot of money for something, and then something similar for well. I mean, but that's philatelist. Well, it's collecting anything for you, isn't it? Really, sometimes you've got to decide how much you want it. But I certainly wouldn't pay €2,000 for it. That was it. Going rate for that, something like that, probably about I don't know, in dollars, $300 or $400, something like that. If with a nice, reasonable embossed on it. So it's not that expensive. Well, it's pricey. It's not cheap, but it's not a silly price.
Paul Davey, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, just to say thank you very much, Adrian. I very much enjoyed it. Looking forward to part 2.
Yeah, oh, well, that's good.
It's interesting in what you said about the German Legion. I have an interest in the Swiss Legion. They weren't allowed to recruit in Switzerland, so the recruiting centre was literally across the border in France. And the troops were massed in a camp in Kent in England.
Well,
They got out as far as Turkey, but never made it to the Crimea. But there is an interesting correspondence whilst they were in England, waiting to go out to the east.
I didn't know
Unfortunately,
that.
I was unable to buy it because it went for too much money at Corinthia a few years back.
Yeah, the Swiss Legion is very, very rare. I've seen an envelope. Cavendish had an envelope for an officer of the Italian Legion at Malta. I chased it but didn't get it. I know somebody who's got another one. I didn't know the Swiss Legion had actually got out to Turkey, which quite impresses me.
Apparently so,
You're saying about recruiting just over the border. That sounds very plausible, because what they did with the German Legion had they were recruited via the British base in Heligoland, because Britain had the little island of, until 1890. Britain held the little island of Heligoland off the German coast, and they used that for their recruiting. And I can't which auctioneer it was. One of the auctioneers, one of the European auctioneers, actually had a letter from the base at Heligoland. It wasn't sent via a concession rate, but I think it went for quite a few €1,000.
My understanding was that the Germans who had been recruited were not allowed back into Germany, having
That's
volunteered to fight for a foreign army, which is why
yeah.
so many of them ended up in South America.
Yeah, yeah, South Africa as well.
Yeah.
And some went to India, but quite a few went to South Africa. So yeah, that's the
Fascinating
problem.
history.
That's the problem. If you left, you couldn't come back.
Thanks.
All right. Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, come on, you guys, are there any historians out there? Because I'd love to see, we look at philately, we tend to look at philately like the stamps and the rarity, but there's a big, as Adrian pointed out, he's more of a historian, more from the historical perspective. So, I know I invited a bunch of historians to the talk to just get their point of view on how we as philatelists treat history. So interested to hear if there's any. Dan, you are a historian, huh?
Well, I've taught history in high school in the United States, and I've lived a lot of it. I'm older than I seem there. I've been an artillery officer and traveled most parts of the world in the Marine Corps and U.S. Army. And I always found it interesting how British policy was always to, keep any particular country from getting too strong on the continent. And that's what they always did. And too bad some of that didn't happen this past time when Russia took Crimea this last time around, that there wasn't a coalition built up to say no, and the United States is at fault also, obviously, to say no, you shall not come this far.
How do you do it
Because
bigger?
none of this other stuff might have, might not have, all this other stuff might not have happened also in Ukraine. So
Yeah, well, that's what I said at the start. There's a lot of what happened in the past is reflected in what's happening now. It's
I guess I
quite
raised my
canny.
hand.
Yeah, go ahead, Mary.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
Well,
Mary is a historian, right?
I'm a Russian historian. And so I thought it was a wonderful presentation. But I had a quarrel with the reason for the sale of Alaska. James Gibson is a major historian on this, and his reason was, he's written several books about this, but the main reason he puts forth is that the provisioning was too expensive. Russia was a capitalist country at that time, and Alaska was under the Russian-American company, as a lot of, India was under the British company and so on. And it was just way too expensive. Well, first of all, the Russians were on the periphery of Alaska and in the Aleutian Islands. And to get provisions to keep the people there, it was just draining the company. So he has the accounting books showing in his books, and it was just a burden, and they decided to get rid of it, never knowing that gold and oil would be discovered later on.
I'd agree with that. I mean, for a start, there was no Trans-Siberian Railway there, and there won't be for another 50 years. And that, even when it was just a single track.
That's right. The Trans-Sib was only done in the 1890s, really. Yeah. It was one track for a long time, until World War I. Yeah. But so they used ships. Yeah. But I found your presentation absolutely fascinating about the mail, because it was amazing that they and the collaboration with the French was great, because in World War I it isn't that way, and in World War II even. Certainly in World War II there's a big clash when the Brits bomb the French fleet. because they're under German occupation. That was terrible. So
Yeah.
this was a nice, happy thought.
Yeah, there is a quite amusing anecdote in that Lord Raglan, the British Commander-in-Chief,
Uh-huh.
was the Duke of Wellington's private secretary. And Lord Raglan lost his arm at Waterloo, at the Battle of Waterloo, fighting the French. And he demanded his arm back because he got his wedding ring on his hand. So they gave him that back. But the problem was he was getting into his 60s when they went out to the Crimea. And when he was talking about the Russians, he kept forgetting that the French were our allies. And there's an apocryphal story that he kept referring to the Russians as the French.
Human nature intervening, certainly.
Yes.
Mary, could you put that book that you referenced and the author in the chat?
Okay, yeah, I have, let me get it. I
You lost Mary.
Yeah, she's going to get her book.
Okay, this is one of his books, Imperial Russia.
Your camera isn't on. Hold on.
Okay.
You'd have
James
to.
Gibson, Imperial Russia in Frontier America. And he's written a number of books, but this is Oxford University Press, 1976. And it's really interesting. You know, there are books on the treatment of the Aleutian, of the Aleut Indians or people, not Indians, I guess. There's a lot of, you know, Native American material that has come up, but the problem of provisioning is what he emphasizes.
Oh yeah, I mean that was. I certainly wouldn't disagree with that. I mean that was just another factor in the selling of the. It
was just too far away.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's what they found in the Russian-Japanese War, provisioning the army. When you go about 1 million men fighting the Japanese on one railway, it was really difficult. But ships are a lot more efficient than.
Well, and they, you know, it was just the returns didn't, the returns or the profits that they had hoped for, whatever, the pelts. He stresses they mainly went to the Aleutian Islands and Alaska for fur pelts.
Yeah.
And for seal pelts, because they had decimated their own fur-bearing animals in Russia by this time, in Siberia. The Russians had reached the coast, the Pacific coast of Siberia by the middle of the 17th century. And the main quest at that time was fur-bearing animals, which they assessed and took from the natives. And those were, they were dying out. They had over used the fur-bearing animals. So that's what brought them to the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, was the seal pelts that they needed. And they made the Aleuts collect those, and then the Indians on the periphery. But by the middle of the 19th century, styles had changed. Fur hats were no longer in vogue, and so they were behind the curve, and they didn't need all the furs, and it was just too expensive to supply the food and so on to the few people running things in Alaska, and that's why they gave it up.
Yeah.
According to James Gibson.
That's very good.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Dennis, you have a question?
Not a question, more a contact. How do you say not a question, but a comment? Because I am actually a Ottoman Empire philatelist. So this is my main drive, my main interest in philately. And that's why I wanted to listen to this carefully, to this expression, to this presentation because the Crimean War led to a serious, how do you say, disaster for the Ottoman Empire, which eventually, you know, through the next 50 to 70 years led to its downfall. So that's why I'm here. But I also wanted to know if you have much postal history from the Ottoman side of the Crimean War. So that's why I'm looking forward to your next
Yeah, well, that's the thing,
presentation.
again, not a lot. I have a medal award signed by Omar Pasha, and I have a couple of letters that from an English officer with the Turkish army in Erzurum in eastern Turkey, and that has was sent by the diplomatic bag, but it has in Turkish at the top right hand corner to England, for England. I even checked it I asked somebody and then I checked it with it's amazing what you can find on the internet, because I'd got an old Ottoman dictionary. Because again, like Russian, Ottoman Turkish is nothing like modern Turkish. So I mean, Russian's changed as well. The language has changed. It's quite amazing, really.
Thank you.
Aja, you have your hand up?
Yeah, no, I was going to say, well anyway, thank you, Adrian, for the lecture. It's fascinating. To Joan's comment, I am a historian, but more of an Islamic art historian rather than of the Crimean War in particular. But of course, very interesting and very interested to listen to next month's talk about the Ottoman side. And yes, the Arabic script with Ottoman is puzzling for me. I mean, I'm pretty conversant with Arabic, but Ottoman is something a little bit different. So yeah, not so easy.
Yeah, and because of coins, I did. Well, I'm not saying I know them now, but I did know my numbers, and that was about my limit. I can tell 6 and 7 and such like, and obviously 0 was 0. But yeah, I mean, the one thing about that I should say, and it's anti-British, but at the start of the war, the British looked down on the Turks. You know, that we were supposed to be fighting with them, but there were a lot of snobbery, shall we say, and racism, and the British tended to look down on the Turks. And towards the end of the war, especially in the defence of the city of Kars, in eastern Turkey, south of the Caucasus, the Russians attacked it and besieged it. And although it was a British officer, all British officers were in command, the Turks defended until they basically ran out of supplies. And when well led, the Turks proved to be extremely good soldiers. And even at the Battle of Balaclava, when they say they were pushed out of the redoubts, it was only because they were facing overwhelming odds. But again, some of the British officers looked down on them as cowards, but they'd actually been attacked by about a few thousand Cossacks and artillery, and infantry. So, one could forgive them to some extent. But they were actually good troops. They did have a tendency to plunder, which particularly at Kerch, when the Turks occupied Kerch, they were quite brutal. But which was commented on in a number of letters. That's another thing. I collect postal history, but I collect letters, and you can learn a heck of a lot, because as I just said, there was no censorship.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that what's kind of come up is that history repeats itself. I mean, from the beginning about Putin's adventures in the Crimean as well. They say that history does repeat itself and people don't learn from history, and they're repeating it. That's one thing. But the other thing I wanted to come back to, was it Mary Schaefer talking about wildlife, the fur trade in Latvia, where I am now at home. Now that we're in the post-Soviet era, wildlife has come back. So we do have natural life. We have bears and stuff. I mean, not so many that it's invading cities, but actually there's a resurgent. Nature actually is back again.
Yes.
That's
that's
great
just-
to hear. Especially with the bears. We could send you some bears.
Yeah, this is going a little bit off topic, but
Well, it's slightly, yeah, but I mean, it was just something that
no,
was
no,
meant-
no, no, no. I'm not saying it's what I'm going to say is going to be a little bit off topic. I wasn't implying you were off topic. What I was going to say is off topic. I was saying this is going to be a little bit off topic. But when Mary was talking about the fur trade in Alaska and the end of the fur trade, it made me think of John Jacob Astor in New York, because he made his original fortune in furs at the start of the 19th century. And then he put it into brownstone housing in New York and basically made his money back that way. But the original Astor fortune was made in furs. So sorry, I wasn't implying you were digressing, I've digressed.
You
So-
were planning to digress.
Yeah.
It's no problem, but just as a final comment that I very much like the idea of the history of postal history, looking at the historical aspects, and as Joan knows very well, that in 2026 doing Philat in Riga, and I really like to have the emphasis on the academic, the historical side, as well as the philatelic one, but in parallel, not as one imbalancing the other.
I
So
think
thank you very much.
No, just all I could tell you is my bent on this is looking at some of our talking to Bernard and like listening to the whole family stories. One thing that came to me is like a lot of these researchers were philatelically convenient with history, and they didn't quite tell the full story of the history. They just made enough to make the postal bit make sense. If that, if I'm trying to get that across. And I like postal history because you could tell the whole story if you look hard enough.
yes,
So-
I agree with that. I mean, as Rob said when he introduced me, one of my interests is early letters before 1750. Well, if you go back to before 1660, we've got early letters and they don't have any postmarks, and some of them were carried by hand and delivered by a servant. So philatelists, as strict philatelists, wouldn't necessarily be interested in them. But philately, looking at postal history, they are part of postal history. Even if it were delivered by a servant, it's still moving, communicating from one person to another. And the amount of social, political, cultural history that you get, of which the post is a part. And I can't see that you can have one without the other personally. It puts the flesh on the bones. And sometimes, again, a Crimean War letter, I had a a letter, an envelope, just an envelope, and I researched the person who'd sent it. And he's writing to his wife from Scutari. Scutari, not the hospital, but the actual depot at Scutari, because they had a depot later on. And he sent this on, and when I looked it up, he got promoted from major to colonel. And that letter was sent on the day he got promoted. So it's going to be rather obvious that he's telling his wife in excitement about his promotion. But I haven't got the letter. I don't know that. But I think it can be steadily assumed that that's one of the things he would be writing about. Also, another thing to look at is you look on the underside of the envelopes, on the flaps, because sometimes people wrote little messages. And so even when the letter's gone and it's not an entire, you can still find things on the underside of the envelopes, little messages and such, which can still bring it to life. And I think that postal history and looking at what was in the letter, not just what was on the envelope, but who sent it, who they sent it to, why they sent it, can tell so much more. And as I tried to illustrate with those two letters, those written by Edward Hay, who actually was killed quite young in New Zealand, fighting the Maoris. But Edward Hay, one envelope I didn't know much about. But it's only when I bought the other envelope with the letter, I could then link them both to the Crimean War. And I was so, because I got the 1 and 9 rate one quite cheaply because there was no real reference on it. And it was just so, I was just so chuffed when I found that I got that reference, and I could set it in its historical context.
Well, as a museum person, I 100% agree with you. Totally. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, didn't museums sometimes deacquisition the envelopes and only keep the letters?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you're being really mercenary, probably the best way to earn money out of it is to split the letters up from the envelopes. So the envelopes to the philatelists and the letters to the historians. I would not dream of doing that, but that's probably the way to maximize your profit if you just did it for profit. But it's sacrilege in my opinion. But you get that. I mean, I've got a lot of separate letters, and I mean, occasionally I've actually managed to unite a letter with an envelope. But especially, and also you can research the letters, like the Fanny Doobly. I haven't actually been to the British Library, but the Fanny Doobly correspondence is in the British Library, so you could actually find the letters that went in the envelopes that you've just bought.
Wow.
That's really interesting.
Right. Well, I hate to say this. Would it be all right if it's nearly 1 o'clock in the morning here? So
Richard, one more question.
all
You
right,
can be
yeah,
our
that's
last
fine.
question.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. Very fascinating. My question is, have you seen or do you have in your collection any mail going to or from the Crimean and India? As I understand it, at least some British officers, if not a British regiment, was sent from India to the Crimean. I know the Indian Army, which was under the British East India Company, was not, none of the sepoys went to the Crimean, but I believe some British officers and enlisted went.
Yeah, I don't know of any British officers for certain, but I certainly wouldn't dispute that. I mean, there was certainly when the rebellion broke out, there was certainly a lot of regiments went in the other direction. In fact, Mrs. Doobly, who was with her husband in the 8th Hussars, actually was out in a cavalry charge in India. She was quite a good horsewoman, and the regiment cavalry charged, and her horse decided to go along with them, with her on it. But her husband a famous one in the same regiment is Clement Walker Heanage, and he won the Victoria Cross out in India. With regard to your original question, I don't have any letters going to India, but I could tell you where one is. I haven't bought it because it's quite expensive, and the address has been damaged. It's got some damage to it, in my opinion. There is a dealer in Britain called Martin Townsend, and he did have one to India. Don't know whether he's still got it, but if you are interested in looking at it, that is from the Crimea to I think it's from the Crimea to India. But as I said, I would have liked to have gone for it, but I decided not to.
Thank you very much.
Any
Hello,
other questions?
Hello,
Dan?
yeah, I'm gonna have to run. I have some extended family just showed up, and you know how that is. Mr. Pearson, I really enjoyed your presentation. I thought it was great. It's got me interested. I used to collect stamps. I have, a pretty large collection for, that's non-directional specific, and collecting for, as part of a collection has put a new idea in my head. And if I continue, I'm only 68% British, so I hope I'm allowed to come back. And
Everyone is welcome here.
And I said, anybody who wants to ask any questions, and it can be forwarded on. I do want feedback, good or bad. So if there's anything that can be improved, please say. Okay.
Thanks for your service, Dan.
Yeah.
yeah,
Well,
the American
thank you.
peoples thank me every month with their tax dollars because I am collecting pension. Thank you, folks.
Well, it's well deserved, let me tell you. I mean,
Well, if nobody's got anything more to ask me, if it's all right with you, I'll go to bed because, as I say, it's getting on for 1 o'clock.
no, you have to work tomorrow. So do
I do. As I said, I'm a learning designer, so I've got to get back to me what they call emulations, well, they're actually simulations. I'll say goodbye, and I hope
Thank
you all
you so
enjoyed it.
much.
No, I'm
Great presentation.
right.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Adrian.
Right. Bye-bye then.